Welcome to Meet the Press with Alex and Jake. I'm Jake Landsberg.
I'm Alex Beinstein.
This week we by far have our biggest guest possibly ever, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Thank you very much for coming on. I can't tell you how much I appreciate having you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have him today. Somebody who's really devoted towards making sure there's clean waters and we're breathing fresh air. So what influenced you to write this book, Crimes Against Nature, How George W. Bush and his corporate pals are plundering the country and hijacking our democracy?
I was asked by, I've been an environmental advocate for 21 years. I work for Natural Resource Defense Council, and I also work for Riverkeeper. And I do a lot of writing on the environment. About a year ago, Jan Wenner, who's the publisher of Rolling Stone magazine, asked me to do an article laying out George Bush's environmental record for Rolling Stone. The article was published in December of last year, and it caused a lot of controversy. And about 3 weeks later, HarperCollins asked me to turn it into a book. It gave me basically until March to do it. And so, I did my best to kind of lay out. The book is not so much about the environment as it is about the corrosive impact of excessive corporate power on American democracy. The Bush, and I've been for 20 years as an environmental advocate, I've been nonpartisan and bipartisan in my approach to this issue. I don't think there's any such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. I think the worst thing that could happen to the environment is it becomes the province of a single political party. But you can't talk honestly about the environment in any context today without speaking critically about this president. This is the worst environmental president that we've had in American history. If you go to NRDC's website, the Natural Resource Defense Council, you'll see over 400 major environmental rollbacks that have been promoted by this administration during the last 3.5 years as part of a deliberate, concerted effort to eviscerate 30 years of environmental law.
And just to mention this book, all this information that you're telling us is in the book. And the book is available at Explorer Bookstore here in town, signed copies, which you did the other night when we went in and saw you doing the autograph signing. So the book is available, plenty of copies there, signed by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., so be sure to check that out.
Would you say one of the problems with this Bush administration is apathy towards the environment? I know you said in his 253-page book about his life before being president, he had one single sentence devoted towards the environment, and in his whole State of the Union speech in 2004, he mentioned it zero. No, none. Do you think the problem is apathy, or would you go a step further?
The problem, I mean, if you're asking me why the public doesn't care more about this and why they reelected a guy with this kind of a record, I'd say there's two reasons for that, and both of them have to do with the flow of information in our society. The public simply does not know this is happening. My book is a bestseller, but that means that it's sold 70,000 copies, but there's 270 million people in this country, and most of the people who voted for George W. Bush don't know anything about the policies that he's promoting for two reasons. One is the administration has launched this environmental jihad as a stealth attack. They have used a number of mechanisms to conceal their radical agenda from the American people, including Orwellian rhetoric. When they want to destroy the forest, they call it the Healthy Forest Act. When they want to destroy the air, they call it the Clear Skies Bill. But most insidiously, they've put polluters in charge of virtually all the agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution. The head of the Forest Service is a timber industry lobbyist. The head of public lands is a mining industry lobbyist. The head of the air division at EPA is a utility lobbyist who's done nothing but represent the worst air polluters in America. The second in command of EPA is a Monsanto lobbyist. The woman who runs Superfund is a woman whose last job was advising corporate polluters how to evade Superfund. And if you look at all of the subsecretariats and agency heads in the Department of Agriculture, Energy, Department of Interior, and EPA, you find the same thing. It's the polluters who are running the agencies that are supposed to be protecting Americans from pollution. And these individuals have not entered government service for the public interest, but rather to subvert the very laws they're now charged with enforcing. The problem is they can do it secretly without the public knowing it. The president is not bringing these bills to Congress and saying, let's dismantle this, all of our environmental laws. If he did that, there would be at least some public debate on it, and the public and the press would be aware of it. But the way, and I show this in my book, the way that the White House has chosen to do this is below the radar because they know the environment is popular both with Republicans and Democrats. And they know, and I have a memo in this book that we got a secret memo from Frank Luntz, who's the president's pollster, to the president, that we obtained a copy of it. And it says, if the American people find out what we're doing, there's going to be a huge payback in the polls. So we have to keep this secret, and that's what the White House has done. Now, we have a press in this country that's supposed to expose these kind of secrets. The problem is the American press is no longer doing its job, and that is the biggest tragedy for American democracy.
So how much does it frustrate you when you watch the second debate with Kerry and Bush, and he calls himself a steward of the land, and really the media doesn't challenge him on that?
Well, not only that, but there were 3 debates, and as you point out, in only one of those debates was there a question about the environment, and it didn't come from a reporter. It came from a member of the press. The reporters of the audience. It was, but you had press people asking questions for most of the debate, and they were asking questions about abortion rights and about gay marriage and about the personal faith of the candidates, as if that's what was at stake in this election. And that's what Karl Rove wanted the American people to think was at stake in this election. But the press was asleep during the entire election. The New York Times and the LA Times have already had to apologize for their role in not asking the tough questions during the run-up to the Iraq War, but they've never apologized for what they've done to the lack of coverage of the environment, and they've covered it better than anybody in the country. The White House press corps have become stenographers for this administration. At best, the journalists today think that they've done their job if they get a press release from the White House and a press release from the Kerry campaign of the Democratic Party, and they say, well, now we've achieved balance. But a journalist's job is to do more than achieve balance. It's to discern the truth and then convey the truth to the American people, and that is not being done by the American press.
Has that? Would it be fair to say that that's never really been done, though? Because there's always been things.
No,
that the press
you know what?
never...
You can still today glean good information from the print media, but the broadcast media has completely fallen apart in this country, and the reason for that was because of the abolishment of the Fairness Doctrine by Ronald Reagan in 1987. We had a doctrine in this country, the Fairness Doctrine, that governed the American press, the broadcast media, since 1927, since the advent of commercial radio. And that doctrine said that the airwaves belong to the public. They don't belong to the broadcasters. They belong to the public. The broadcasters are licensed to use them, but only with the proviso that they use them to benefit the public interest and to advance our democracy. The Fairness Doctrine had 3 principal requirements. One is that the broadcasters air issues of public import. They would have had to talk about the environment or they would have lost their license. Number 2, they had to show both sides of an issue. You couldn't have had a Fox News under the Fairness Doctrine. You couldn't have had a Rush Limbaugh or talk radio under the Fairness Doctrine. Number 3, you had to have diversity of control and local control. And what happened is Reagan abolished that as a favor to these kind of right-wing Christian fundamentalist broadcasters and the studio heads who contributed so much to his campaign. And today, the only constraints, what's happened since then is you now have 6 companies, 6 large multinationals that control every radio station in America and all of the television stations in America and 80% of the newspapers. The television news departments have become corporate profit centers. They no longer have an obligation to benefit the American public. So their only obligation is to their shareholders. How do they satisfy that obligation? By expanding viewership so they can sell more ad space. How do you expand viewership? Why, you do that by appealing to the prurient interest that all of us have in the reptilian core of our brain for sex and celebrity gossip. So they give us Lacey Peterson, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jackson, and lots of terror alerts because that gets viewership as well. But they're not telling us the real news that is affecting people in this country. The fact that today, 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury in her womb that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases, autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, kidney disease, because of a decision that was made by this president. The EPA announced 4 months ago that in 19 states, it's now unsafe to eat any freshwater fish because of mercury. And in 48 states, at least some of the fish are unsafe to eat because of mercury.
And you mentioned in your book that in Houston, Texas, which is now the most polluted city in the United States, has the children that are born there are at a severe risk for Down syndrome. Is that's
right?
also because
Well,
of
but
corporations?
Yeah,
that
and this is, and the president under Governor Bush's leadership, Texas became the most polluted state in the country. The polluters were allowed to run Texas, and they ran it into the ground at public expense. They treated the air and water and the landscapes of Texas as if it were a business in liquidation. And that's what happened to Texas. Now it's happening to the rest of us. We know where this mercury is coming from. Mercury in our fish, which 48 states, at least some of the fish are now unsafe to eat. In 19 states, all of the fish are now unsafe to eat. The mercury is coming primarily from 1,100 coal-burning power plants. And here's what we know about mercury. 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury, dangerous levels of mercury in her womb, so that her children are at risk, autism, particularly mental retardation, lower IQ. I have so much mercury in my body. I got my levels tested recently, just from eating fish. My levels are double the levels that are considered safe. Wow. I was told by Dr. David Carpenter, who's the national authority on mercury contamination, that a woman with my levels of mercury in her womb would have children with cognitive impairment. And I said to him, you mean she might have? And he said, no, the science is very certain. Her children would be permanently brain damaged, probably a permanent IQ loss in those kids of 5 to 7 points. Today, there are 630,000 children born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. The Clinton administration, recognizing the gravity of this national health epidemic, reclassified mercury as a hazardous pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That triggered a requirement that all those polluters remove 90% of the mercury within 3.5 years. But that's an industry that gave $100 million in contributions to this president since the 2000 election cycle. And about 8 weeks ago, the Bush White House announced it was abolishing the Clinton-era rules and substituting instead rules that were written by utility industry lobbyists, which will allow those polluters to continue polluting with mercury forever. So today, we are living in a science fiction nightmare where my children and the children of millions of other Americans can no longer engage in the seminal, primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father or mother and come home and eat the fish because somebody gave money to a politician.
So when, all these valid points you bring up, how frustrating is it when you have the Limbaughs, the Hannitys, the O'Reillys, all these people on the right just say you're some stupid liberal and talking nonsense? How frustrating is that?
Well, this is what I signed up for, which is that, this is a fist fight. This is the apocalypse. This is the apocalyptical battle against the forces of ignorance and greed.
And you also argue that the indifference from the media towards the environment has dated back all the way since 1963 when JFK went around the country. You said talking about an environmental crisis, and in fact the people in the media didn't even want to ask him about that. They just want to talk about economics and politics.
Yeah, and that's a natural impulse of the media, because the things that the press wants to bring in advertisers and they want to bring in more viewership. So they want to talk about celebrity gossip and they want to talk about sex because that's what brings in viewership. But it's not something that advances our democracy. It's not useful information for a democracy. And we had in 1963, even though the press didn't particularly want it, they were forced to cover these issues because we had the fairness doctrine there. They could have lost their licenses. You could have petitioned and said, NBC is not talking about the environment. Last year, according to Tyndall Service, which is the service that analyzes news contents on the networks, Tyndall Service said that of the 15,000 minutes of network news, only 4% were devoted to the environment. And most of those stories were, human interest type stories like whales caught in sea ice that had nothing relevant to our democracy. Well, if that were true prior to 1987, we could have petitioned to have the FCC yank the license of those networks for not airing issues of public import. They were required to do it under the law. But today, Ronald Reagan, has abolished the fairness doctrine, and the media companies have become, commercial values have supplanted the values of our democracy.
So you would say that there's this whole myth with the liberal media because, as you pointed out, the Republicans are very vulnerable on the environment, but you didn't really hear it from the so-called liberal media.
The idea of a liberal media has always been a myth. There was never a liberal media in this country. There was a commercial media that was dominated by the networks. But today you have a right-wing dominated media in this country. Talk radio is overwhelmingly right-wing, probably 98% right-wing. And cable news, which is led by Fox, is also right-wing. There are no liberal voices. In fact, the only liberal voices left on network news are comedians, essentially Bill Maher and Jon Stewart, and then then you have Alan Combs on Fox, who is really
they don't even let him talk.
Deliberately meek.
They let
he
Hannity
plays the Washington General to Hannity's Harlem Globetrotters. His function is to lose every battle. You can name me dozens and dozens of right-wing commentators throughout the networks. You can't name me any liberal ones.
I mean, you got to give Chris Matthews tends to be on the left. You have to give
Chris Matthews?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Chris
Really?
Matthews supported George Bush.
He didn't support George Bush.
Chris Matthews supported George Bush. And Chris Matthews, I defy you to name me an issue in which Chris Matthews is liberal on. I don't, and the book that you should read is David Brock's book. It's probably the most important book that was written during the last 10 years, and it's called The Republican Noise Machine. And David Brock was part of this conspiracy by the right wing to take over the American media. And he worked for Richard Mellon Scaife at the American Spectator magazine. He worked for the Heritage Foundation and for Sun Myung Moon's Washington Times, which became a breeding ground for these right-wing pundits. But you had billions and billions of dollars poured in by the Coors Foundation, by Richard Mellon Scaife, by the Olin and J.M. Bradley Foundation. The same people that funded the anti-environmental movement in this country also funded the takeover of the American media, and it's been a huge success story for them.
So I have to ask, do you think there will become a point where the environment, unfortunately, will get in such bad shape that the media will be forced to cover? They'd have to go away from sex and celebrity gossip and cover the environment more than 4% of the time. I mean, 90% of the time.
Not unless we bring back the fairness doctrine. Our democracy is in trouble, and the people in our country are badly misinformed. And I don't believe that there's any big philosophical gap between the red states and the blue states. It's really an information gap. The Pitkin report, which was published by the University of Maryland, was part of a survey that was done of people who voted for George W. Bush in the last election. 70% of those people believe that Saddam Hussein bombed the World Trade Center. 40% believe that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. 90% believe that George Bush is doing a good job on the environment. This is misinformation, and it is pervasive in the red states of this country. When you get out of the circulation spheres for the LA Times and New York Times and some of the other big city newspapers in the blue states, that people have this very, very bad information that's causing them to vote against their own economic interests and vote for people who are very damaging to their own economic interests. And that's really the problem in our country, is the press has really, the fourth estate has let down American democracy and let down the American people. And the only way to restore that, in my view, is to bring back the fairness doctrine, to require them to start doing their job.
So, I mean, you're here obviously in Colorado, which is a red state, but then again, you look at Aspen and it tends to be very liberal. So would you say that coming here, you're kind of preaching to the choir, because people here, they live here because of the beautiful views, the clean air, I mean, the small area. So this is a great place to be, is it not?
I travel all over the country. I do about 40 talks a year, mainly in red states and mainly to Republican audiences. And I don't get a different response when I'm speaking to Republican audiences versus Democratic audiences.
You mentioned in your book
Except the Republicans say, why didn't I know this before? How come nobody told me this? And they're as indignant and angry about the president's action the problem is really an information deficit. They are not getting the information. And if they were, they'd vote the same way Democrats are. 80% of Republicans are just Democrats who don't know what's going on.
But, I mean, you can't completely say that the liberals are losing their total voice. I mean, you look at Al Franken on the radio, you look at Janine Garofalo.
Those are Air America, and I have a show on Air America too. And Air America is the first beachhead that we have, that liberals have, in a media that's otherwise, in the talk radio media, which is otherwise almost completely dominated by right-wing pundits.
They do have the print media, which tends to be liberal as well, the New York Times.
Well,
and the
80% of the newspapers in this country are owned and edited by Republicans. So, but there still is good information that can be gleaned from newspapers. The problem is, most Americans get their information from the broadcast media.
So like you're saying, it's not fair to say that, just because the newspapers are Republicans, that the Republicans don't care about the environment. It's just that they're misinformed because they don't have the fairness doctrine from the network. So
right.
Is there any possible way to get that fairness doctrine back, or to do something else to
Well, there's a bill on
inform the
Capitol
people?
Hill right now to try to restore the fairness doctrine. And in fact, when Reagan abolished it, Congress, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, then voted to statutory require the fairness doctrine. Reagan vetoed that and got away with it. So there always was support among Republicans as well for the fairness doctrine. But today you've got very right-wing Republicans running Capitol Hill, and they are not going to let the fairness doctrine pass.
Alex, do you think one way to maybe solve these issues is you look at high schools and kids are taking biology, they're taking chemistry, they're taking physics, but they don't really have environmental studies type classes. Do you think maybe if there was legislation somehow pushed where in high schools in the country that you mandated that kids learn about environmental studies?
I think they should just learn science. I mean, right now, science is under attack as well.
They want to teach creationism.
Yeah, there's And these are people who think that God is as stupid as they are. That Genesis is science, and it's not. It's it's theology and it's faith or whatever you want to call it, but it's not science. And we have a president now. There's 60% of the American public don't believe in evolution, and we have a president who also says the jury's still out on evolution. Well, how are you going to convince a person like that global warming is a problem? What kind of evidence would you need?
And you also say that there's a contradiction within this religious right, so to speak, because, I mean, if they did really that religious and you go to the tenets of their faith, they should care about protecting the land and the environment, and it's so hypocritical,
this
isn't it?
administration claims to embrace Christianity, but they have violated every one of the manifold mandates of the Christian faith, that we care for the environment, that we treat it responsibly, and that we treat future generations responsibly. And the Bible is filled with mandates, and the Christian faith is filled with mandates that we care for the environment. But this is a Christian heresy that they've embraced, and it's called dominion theology. And it's a belief, and it's the same kind of people who, use Christianity to justify slavery during the Civil War. You can use the Bible to justify, the most heinous crimes, and they are now using the Bible to justify the destruction of the planet. And they say, they believe that Revelations, the chapter of the New Testament called Revelations, actually dictates that we should destroy the environment because that will hasten the coming of Christ. I mean, and this is, it seems so bizarre and weird that, you wouldn't normally mention it, but unfortunately, the administration is rife with people who actually believe this. James Watt, who was Ronald Reagan's Interior Secretary, swore under oath, testified before the Senate, and was asked, why are you giving away all of our public lands at fire sale prices instead of protecting them for future generations the way that your post mandates that you do? And he replied, I don't know how many future generations there's going to be before the second coming of Christ. And his mentor is Gail Norton, who now runs the Interior Department and has stocked it filled with these right-wing, I don't call it Christianity because it's not. It's a heresy. It's a heresy that, basically benefits the large corporate contributors of this administration, the oil and coal companies, but it has nothing to do with the Christian faith, as I understand it. And it, it's drawing selectively a few lines out of Genesis. There's one line where where God tells Adam and Eve to go out and dominate the earth and subdue nature. But Genesis, if you look at the overall message of Genesis, it's that the message is that we're supposed to act as stewards of the earth, and that we're supposed to be gardeners and tend the garden, and not go out and destroy it.
So instead of using the Bible to justify the environment, I mean, as you mentioned in your book, it's the corporations that are ruining the environment. One of which is in Colorado, Coors Brewer Company.
Well, Coors had a long history. Joseph Coors had a long history of funding the anti-environmental movement. Coors was the largest polluter in Colorado, and he started the Heritage Foundation in the 70s. And the Heritage Foundation, it claims to like free markets, but it doesn't. It's embraced corporate welfare and capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. It offers pithy philosophical justifications for corporate profit taking. That's its only function, and including getting rid of its primary focus from the beginning was ridding America of all of its environmental laws, which interfered with some polluters in their corporate profit taking. And Coors was one of the major funders. Richard Mellon Scaife, another funder. The Olin family, which was munition and oil, has been the other funder. And they've started these right-wing foundations on Capitol Hill, the Heritage Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, which are funded by polluters and by these right-wing foundations, which originally received their money from the polluters. And they're stocked with these phony scientists, we call them biostitutes, who, stay...
I'm sorry to cut you off. We have
cut you
about
off.
30 seconds, but
We're
we
out of time.
appreciated it so much.
Can't thank you enough.
Crimes Against Nature, signed copies.
Explore
at
Bookstore. Be sure to
Bookstore.
check them out. Mr. Kennedy, I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Again, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And this has been Meet the Press. See you next week.
So long.
Hello, Pitkin County. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Please watch GrassRoots TV. This is the voice of democracy.